Hello everyone, thank you for watching this video in which I will answer one of the questions I've got on the channel, and the question is related to the main contracts that we use with Spring Security. These are user details and user details service, and the question sounds like this: do we actually have to implement all the time these contracts, or only when we are using JPA and work with Hibernate or some other implementation where we use the entity classes? And this is in regards to two of the examples I have done previously on this channel. So I have just opened the applications again to review them and to be able to answer the question. And the idea is like this: you are always using user details service and user details as contracts whenever you are using Spring Security and you are dealing with the users, because user details and user details service are the main contracts that are used by Spring Security in order to manage the users. So whenever you manage the users and you use Spring Security, you are using these two contracts. There are ways of using them, different ways of using them. So in this case, for example, in one of the projects, the one in which I have used JdbcUserDetailsManager, I am still using UserDetailsService. Actually, the UserDetailsManager interface, if you go and review it, you will see actually that this is only a particularity of the UserDetailsService. So this is also, I have referred to this as a very good example of interface segregation in one of my other videos where I have discussed about solid principles. So actually we are using UserDetailsService, just that in this example I am not implementing it. I already use an implementation that is provided by Spring Security. So it happens that sometimes we have implementations and we don't need to implement them ourselves. It really depends on what we really want to do. If we find some implementation either in Spring Security, either in a third-party library that fits our need, we can use that implementation. So we will not implement the contract ourselves. We need to implement the contracts only when we need to specify ourselves how the contract looks like as the implementation. So in this case, I have only used an already implemented JdbcUserDetailsManager, and due to the fact that I never refer to the user itself, I didn't have to create an implementation for the user details. So in this example, I only specify the entity that manages the users. In this case, the implementation is done already from Spring Security. I just use it the way it was implemented by providing the data source as a parameter. But again, I still use the contracts, so I can't skip using the contracts. I always use them in a way or another. In the other example that I have also opened here, in which I'm using JPA, I find myself in the situation in which I cannot use a predefined implementation. So in this case, I had to do my own implementations. Usually it happens that you have to do your own implementations. It depends on what exactly your application is doing, where are these users coming from. In my case, they are coming from a database, and I use a SQL database here for persistence. But I could have, for example, used, I don't know, a NoSQL implementation, and probably I wouldn't have found implementation directly, or maybe I would have, but let's assume that I don't find an implementation. Then I have to implement it myself. And how I implement it, how I would implement it is by simply implementing these two contracts that then will be used by Spring Security the way Spring Security was designed in its own architecture. Or for example, I could have the situation in which the users are coming from another system through a web service, for example, or through a socket. In general, for exercises for my students, I recommend them to implement this kind of an application where the users are coming from a file, from a simple file from the file system. So you can do this exercise yourself to make sure that you understood how these contracts are working. This is the easiest way to implement something in which you just define your own implementations for the contracts and you see them working, and for sure you won't find an implementation that is working with something like this, just reading from a file, because this is something that is probably very improbable to see it in a production application. So these two contracts are not related to JPA, they are not related to the implementation. Simply in my case, I had to use them because I didn't have an already implemented functionality for using JPA. Then I had to create my own service and of course implement the correct contract such that Spring Security knows how to use my implementation. Remember that always when a framework implements something, it's exposing the functionality through contracts so that it makes it abstract, and this way everyone can implement those contracts the way is needed in their development for their development purpose. So in my case here it was using JPA, so I had to create an implementation that uses Spring Data. That was the example. I could have done as well, for example, an implementation where the users are coming from a file. The same thing. I would have to implement the user details service and to make that work reading from a file. I could have done this, for example, reading the users from a socket or reading the users from a web service. No matter which the implementation is, if I don't find one implementation already there, already done out of the box to use it in my application from a library or from Spring Security itself, I have to implement it myself. So I still use these contracts. This is not related to Hibernate, it's just related to the fact that I didn't have an already implemented user details service for JPA, so I had to implement it myself. And it was a very good example to prove how to do this. This is mainly why I have done this example, is not for the JPA point of view, but for you to understand how the user details service and respectively the user details is implemented. So yes, in this case I have created my own user details service, and because of that I also had to create my own implementation of the user details, and because I was very lazy, I have just made the entity class myself, implementing also the user details. This is not really correct in all the points of view, from all the points of view, because theoretically here I mixed two responsibilities. So I messed up with the solid principles, but I've done it so just to make it a little bit shorter in my example. Probably better was in this case just to have another class that is wrapping, that is decorating my entity, and this way I would have split it correctly also the responsibilities. But the idea is that because I didn't have an implementation, I had to do it myself. It's not related to Hibernate. It could have been that I have used a file or a web service or something else. Always when you can't find an implementation that already exists, you will use these contracts and you will implement them yourself. Regarding the end of your question, that was related to some implementation that some example that you found on the internet. I can't tell you a lot about that just because I don't know the example, and my experience is with examples with Spring Security, you have to be very careful because these configurations can be done in so many ways, and you will find so many examples with different kind of implementing the same things, and you might get confused of how they are working. I just recommend you to take the basics for the beginning and try to understand correctly what user details is, what user details service is, the password encoder, the granted authority, and all the other interfaces that I have presented in my examples. And I'm still working on the videos on the Spring Security playlist, so you will just find in the near future I will be adding more and more videos that explain more details of the configuration itself. And anyway, I think this is everything that I can say about this for the moment, and I hope that I have clarified your problem. Let me know if there are still things that are unclear, and of course, as usual, I recommend you to take and redo the examples from my videos. So just do them yourself. You will understand much better how these contracts work and how these configurations work if you use them yourself. Thank you very much for watching the video, and again, I hope I have answered the question. If not, let me know and I will try to do another video to make it even more clear. Thank you very much.